The lone silhouette of Rhett Ingram appeared on the dusty horizon, shoulders slumped and reins held loose in his calloused hands as he guided his chestnut stallion down the main street of Salida, Colorado. The year was 1878, and the small mining town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains was just beginning to prosper. Its wooden buildings and boardwalks alive with the bustle of settlers seeking fortune in the untamed West. But Rhett's eyes, usually keen and alert, saw none of it as he rode through town, his mind consumed by the absence at his side where his faithful companion had always trotted. "Whoa," he murmured, pulling his horse to a stop outside the general store. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face as he dismounted. At 32, Rhett had spent more than half his life on horseback, moving from ranch to ranch, taking whatever work came his way. His only constant companion had been Scout, a loyal cattle dog who'd been by his side for 7 years until 3 days ago. The bell above the door jangled as he pushed inside, the familiar scent of coffee, leather, and tobacco greeting him. A few locals nodded in his direction, but Rhett barely acknowledged them, making his way to the counter where Mr. Peterson, the store owner, was tallying figures in a ledger. "Afternoon, Rhett," Peterson said, looking up. "Any luck finding Scout?" Rhett shook his head, his throat too tight for words. He slid a piece of paper across the counter. "Need to put up more notices, running low on supplies too." Peterson's eyes softened with sympathy. "I'll get these copied. Scout's a smart dog. He might find his way back." Rhett nodded curtly, then turned to gather his supplies. He'd been searching the surrounding hills and valleys ever since Scout had bolted after a deer during a thunderstorm. The dog had never failed to return before, but 3 days had passed with no sign of him. As he moved through the aisles, selecting coffee, beans, and jerky, Rhett became aware of a woman's voice at the counter. Something about the gentle lilt of it made him pause. "Just arrived from Boston last week," she was saying. "My uncle's letter said he'd meet me, but there's been no sign of him." "Robert Langford?" Peterson asked. "He's got a small ranch about 5 miles east, been laid up with a broken leg these past 3 weeks, probably couldn't make the journey." "Oh," the woman said, her voice faltering. "I see." Rhett turned the corner of the aisle and saw her for the first time. She stood tall and straight-backed in a travel-worn blue dress, her chestnut hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. When she turned, her eyes met his warm brown and filled with a determination that belied the uncertainty in her voice. "Miss," Peterson called out to Rhett, "this here's Leona Langford, just arrived from back east. Her uncle's ranch is on your way. Might you escort the lady?" Rhett shifted uncomfortably. The last thing he wanted was company, especially when his heart felt like a stone in his chest, but the woman Leona was looking at him with such open hope that he found himself nodding. "Much obliged," he said gruffly, "heading out in 10 minutes if that suits." Leona's smile brightened her tired face. "Thank you, Mr. Ingram, Rhett Ingram." He tipped his hat slightly, then turned back to his shopping, aware of her watching him. 20 minutes later, they were on the trail out of town, Leona seated on a rented mare beside Rhett's stallion. Her few belongings were strapped behind his saddle, and she rode with surprising ease for an Easterner. "Have you been in Colorado territory long, Mr. Ingram?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving Salida. "Long enough," he replied, scanning the horizon out of habit. "You planning to stay with your uncle?" Leona nodded. "After my parents passed last winter, there seemed little reason to remain in Boston. Uncle Robert wrote that he could use help with the ranch, and I've always longed for adventure." She paused. "Mr. Peterson mentioned you were searching for your dog." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Scout, been with me since he was a pup." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know what it's like to lose someone dear." He glanced at her, surprised by the genuine understanding in her voice. Most people didn't understand how a man could grieve for a dog. "It don't matter," he said finally, the words catching in his throat. "Just a dog." Leona reined her horse to a stop, forcing Rhett to do the same. When he turned to look at her, she was studying him intently. "Then why are you crying?" she asked gently. Rhett blinked, startled to find moisture on his cheeks. He hadn't cried since he was a boy, not even when his mother died or when he'd taken a bullet in his shoulder 2 years back. He wiped at his face roughly. "Dust," he muttered, but they both knew it for the lie it was. Leona didn't press him. Instead, she urged her horse forward again. "Tell me about Scout," she said. "What kind of dog is he?" For a moment, Rhett considered ignoring the question, maintaining the wall he'd built around himself over years of solitary living. But something about Leona Langford's quiet strength broke through his defenses. Australian Shepherd, black and white with one blue eye and one brown, he found himself saying. Smart as a whip and loyal to a fault. As they rode, the story of Scout tumbled out: how Rhett had found him as a half-starved pup beside his dead mother, how the dog had grown to be the finest cattle dog in 3 counties, and how he'd once saved Rhett from a rattlesnake. "He sounds remarkable," Leona said when he finally fell silent. "We'll find him." Rhett looked at her sharply. She met his gaze steadily. "I may be from Boston, Mr. Ingram, but I'm not helpless, and I believe in repaying kindness with kindness." Before Rhett could respond, a distant barking caught his attention. He reined his horse to a sudden stop, listening intently. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. "Scout," he called, standing in his stirrups. The barking grew more insistent, and Rhett wheeled his horse around, heading toward a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. Leona followed closely behind. As they approached the trees, a black and white blur shot out from the underbrush, barking excitedly. Rhett was off his horse before it had fully stopped, dropping to his knees as Scout bounded into his arms, tail wagging furiously. "You ornery mutt," Rhett muttered, burying his face in Scout's fur as the dog licked his face enthusiastically. "Where have you been?" Leona dismounted more carefully, watching the reunion with a smile. When she approached, Scout bounded over to investigate, sniffing her outstretched hand before allowing her to scratch behind his ears. "He's beautiful," she said, laughing as Scout leaned against her skirts, "and he seems no worse for his adventure." Rhett examined his dog carefully, finding him thin but uninjured. Must have got himself lost chasing that deer, or found something worth staying for. He looked up at Leona, a genuine smile transforming his face for the first time. "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," she protested. "You listened," Rhett said simply. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "We'd best get you to your uncle's before nightfall." With Scout trotting happily alongside them, they continued their journey. The conversation flowed more easily now, with Leona sharing stories of her life in Boston and her dreams for the future. "I've always felt confined by the city," she admitted. "All those rules about how a lady should behave, whom she should marry. Out here, perhaps I can find my own path." Rhett nodded. "West's got its own rules, but they're simpler. Work hard, keep your word, help your neighbors. Rest is up to you." As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, they crested a small rise, and Rhett pointed to a modest cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines, with a small barn and corral beside it. "That's Langford's place," he said. "Not much to look at, but the land's good. Stream runs year-round and there's decent grazing for cattle." Leona studied her new home, emotions playing across her face: anxiety, excitement, determination. "It's perfect," she said finally. As they approached, a man appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a crutch. His weathered face broke into a wide smile at the sight of them. "Leona," he called out. "By God, girl, you made it." Robert Langford was a stocky man in his 50s with gray-streaked dark hair and the same warm brown eyes as his niece. He embraced Leona fiercely when she dismounted, then extended his hand to Rhett. "Mighty grateful to you for bringing her safely, Ingram. Been worried sick since I broke this confounded leg and couldn't meet her train." Rhett shook the offered hand. "No trouble, was on my way to check my traps." "Nonsense," Langford said firmly. "You'll stay for supper at least. Can't send a man off without feeding him proper, especially one who's done me such a service." Despite his initial reluctance, Rhett found himself agreeing. As the evening shadows lengthened, he helped Leona unsaddle the horses while Langford hobbled back inside to prepare the meal. "Your uncle seems a good man," Rhett observed as they worked side by side. Leona nodded. "My father always spoke highly of him." They were very different. Father was a banker, very proper and reserved. Uncle Robert was always the adventurer, writing us tales of life out west. She paused, running a hand over her mare's neck. I hope I haven't made a terrible mistake coming here. Rhett studied her thoughtfully. Most Eastern women he'd encountered wouldn't last a month in Colorado territory, but there was something about Leona Langford that suggested steel beneath her polished exterior. You'll do fine, he said finally. Just takes time to find your footing. Her smile of gratitude warmed something long cold inside him. Supper was a simple but hearty affair of rabbit stew and biscuits. Scout lay contentedly by the fire, occasionally raising his head when his name was mentioned as Rhett recounted finding him. Langford was an engaging host, full of stories about the area and practical advice for his niece. Ranch isn't much, he admitted, but it's growing. Got 30 head of cattle and could expand if I had help. He glanced meaningfully at Rhett. Always looking for good hands, especially now with this leg slowing me down. Rhett shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't stayed in one place for more than a few months since leaving home at 16. Appreciate the offer, but I've got my traps to check, just passing through. Well, offer stands, Langford said easily. Leona here's a quick study, but she'll need someone to show her the ropes. I can't be riding out with the herd for a while yet. Later, as Rhett prepared to leave, Leona walked him to his horse. The night was clear, stars spread like diamond dust across the velvet sky. Will you really just check your traps and move on? She asked quietly. Rhett busied himself adjusting his saddle. It's what I do. Even Scout found his way back to what matters, she observed. He glanced at the dog, who was looking between them with ears perked forward, as if following the conversation. I'm not good at staying, Rhett admitted. Perhaps you haven't found the right reason yet. Leona held his gaze for a moment, then stepped back. Thank you again, Mr. Ingram. For everything. As Rhett rode away, Scout trotting beside him, he found himself looking back more than once at the warm light of the cabin window. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur for Leona. Each day brought new challenges and skills to master milking the cow, mending fences, learning to identify the brands on neighboring cattle. Uncle Robert was patient but exacting, determined that his niece would become self-sufficient. Can't always count on having help, he'd say as he taught her to handle a rifle or build a fire. Woman out here needs to stand on her own 2 feet. Leona embraced every lesson eagerly, her city's soft hands gradually growing calloused and strong. The physical labor was exhausting, but satisfying in a way her previous life had never been. Each night she fell into bed pleasantly tired, her dreams occasionally visited by a certain cowboy with quiet eyes and a loyal dog. She heard nothing of Rhett Ingram until early June, when a neighboring rancher stopped by with news. Saw your friend Ingram in town yesterday, Mrs. Hollister reported while delivering a crock of butter. Said he's taken work with the Coopers over near Twin Lakes. Temporary, of course. Man never stays put. Leona ignored the flutter of disappointment in her chest. He's not exactly a friend, he merely escorted me from town. Mrs. Hollister, a formidable widow who ran 40 head of cattle with only her teenage son for help, raised a skeptical eyebrow. Not what I heard. Coopers said he asks after you whenever someone passes through from this way. That evening, as Leona helped her uncle prepare supper, she found herself glancing more often than usual toward the window that faced the road. Something on your mind, girl? Robert asked, his observant eyes missing nothing. Leona blushed. Mrs. Hollister mentioned Mr. Ingram is working for the Coopers. Robert nodded, stirring the beans simmering on the stove. Good man, Ingram. Bit of a drifter, but honest. Helped me bring in my cattle last fall when I was short-handed. Do you think, Leona began, then stopped, unsure what she was even asking. Her uncle smiled knowingly. Man like that doesn't ask after a woman unless he's carrying a torch. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Leona could formulate an answer, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Robert peered out the window, then chuckled. Speak of the devil, he said, moving toward the door. Evening, Ingram, was beginning to think you'd forgotten where we live. Leona smoothed her hair hastily before following her uncle outside. Rhett sat astride his stallion, Scout at his horse's feet, both looking travel-worn but well. Something in Rhett's expression shifted when he saw her, a softening around his eyes that made her heart beat faster. "Miss Langford," he greeted, removing his hat, "you're looking well." "As are you, Mr. Ingram," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her delight at seeing him, "and Scout too." Robert clapped his hands together. "Perfect timing, supper's nearly ready." "Leona makes a fine cornbread, if I do say so myself." Rhett hesitated only briefly before dismounting. "Obliged for the invitation, been a long ride." Over the simple meal, Rhett explained that he'd finished his work for the Coopers and was heading back toward his trapping cabin up in the high country. "Thought I'd stop and see if you needed any help before I went," he told Robert. "Heard in town your leg's not healing as fast as hoped." Robert grimaced. "Doc says I pushed too hard too soon, another month at least before I can ride properly." He cast a meaningful glance between Rhett and his niece. "Leona's been a godsend, but there's work that needs a man's strength." "I'd be happy to stay a few days," Rhett offered, his eyes meeting Leona's briefly. "If that wouldn't be an imposition." "No imposition at all," Leona said quickly, perhaps too quickly, earning a knowing smile from her uncle. Rhett moved into the small bunkhouse beside the barn, and the days fell into a comfortable rhythm. He rode out each morning to check the cattle, sometimes with Leona accompanying him. In the afternoons, they worked together on repairs to the barn roof or clearing new ground for planting. Scout followed them everywhere, becoming as much Leona's shadow as Rhett's. One evening, about a week after Rhett's arrival, Leona found him sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Scout lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws. "May I join you?" she asked, gesturing to the space beside him. Rhett nodded, shifting slightly to make room. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "What are you making?" Leona finally asked, nodding toward the wood in his hands. Rhett held it up. A small figure of a dog was taking shape beneath his skilled knife. "Thought your uncle might like it, kind of a thank you." "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "I didn't realize you were an artist." He shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "Just something to pass the time on long nights. My grandfather taught me." "Tell me about your family," Leona said. "You know all about mine, but you've shared so little about yourself." Rhett's hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri. Pa was a farmer who drank too much. Ma died when I was 15, left home a year later and headed west. Been on my own since, except for Scout. No brothers or sisters. Had a brother, Thomas, died in the war." His tone discouraged further questions on that subject. Leona reached out impulsively and covered his hand with hers. "I'm sorry, it must have been lonely." Rhett looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, illuminated softly in the gathering darkness. "Not always," he said quietly. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Scout whined softly, sensing a change in the atmosphere, and the spell was broken. Rhett gently withdrew his hand and stood. "Getting late," he said. "Early start tomorrow if we're going to move those cattle to the north pasture." Leona nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Good night, Mr. Ingram." He paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at her. "Reckon after all this time you could call me Rhett," she smiled. "Only if you'll call me Leona." "Leona," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. With a nod, he walked toward the bunkhouse, Scout trotting at his heels. The next morning dawned clear and warm, perfect for moving cattle. Leona rode beside Rhett, her confidence on horseback growing daily under his patient guidance. Scout worked tirelessly, keeping the small herd together as they made their way to the lush northern pasture. "You're a natural," Rhett commented as Leona skillfully turned a straying heifer back toward the group. "Most city folks take years to get comfortable on a horse, let alone handling cattle." Leona beamed at the rare compliment. "I had an excellent teacher." They paused atop a ridge overlooking the pasture, watching as the cattle began to graze on the abundant grass. The valley stretched before them, wildflowers painting the meadows in vibrant patches of color against the green. It's breathtaking, Leona said softly. I never imagined such beauty existed. Rhett was watching her rather than the scenery, his expression thoughtful. Why did you really come west, Leona? Truth now. She considered the question, wanting to give him an honest answer. Partly what I told you before, wanting adventure, needing a change after my parents died, but also, she hesitated. I was engaged in Boston to a banker my father approved of. When father died, I realized I was marrying George because it was expected, not because I loved him. So you ran away. I chose a different path, she corrected him. One where I could make my own decisions, even my own mistakes. Rhett nodded slowly. Brave thing to do. What about you? Leona asked. Why do you keep moving? What are you looking for? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked away, his gaze sweeping across the valley. Wasn't looking for anything, just didn't have a reason to stay. And now, the words escaped before she could reconsider them. Rhett turned to her, something unreadable in his expression. But before he could respond, a distant rumble of thunder drew their attention to the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering with alarming speed. Storm's coming, he said, instantly alert. We need to get back. They rode hard, Scout herding the cattle into a sheltered draw as the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the trail that led back to the ranch, the sky had darkened ominously and lightning flashed across the mountains. Too dangerous to continue, Rhett shouted over the rising wind. Line shacks just over that rise, we'll wait it out there. The small cabin was barely visible through the sheets of rain as they approached. It was a simple one-room structure, built as a shelter for cowboys working the distant pastures. Rhett dismounted quickly and helped Leona down, then led the horses to a lean-to at the side of the cabin. Inside, the shack was dusty but dry. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot against the wall, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs completed the sparse furnishings. Scout shook himself vigorously, spraying water across the plank floor. Not exactly the Salida Hotel, Rhett commented wryly as he lit the lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. Leona laughed, wringing water from her skirts. It's perfect, though Uncle Robert will be worried. He knows where we were headed. When the storm hit, he'll figure we took shelter. Rhett busied himself starting a fire in the stove with the wood stacked beside it. Need to get those wet clothes dry or you'll catch your death. Leona blushed at the practical suggestion, suddenly very aware of their isolation and proximity. Rhett seemed to realize the awkwardness of the situation at the same moment. I'll check on the horses, he said quickly, heading for the door. You can, change into this. He shrugged out of his dry duster and handed it to her before disappearing back into the storm, Scout following loyally. Left alone, Leona removed her sodden jacket and boots, spreading them near the stove to dry. The duster enveloped her like a tent when she put it on, smelling of leather, tobacco, and something indefinably Rhett. She rolled up the sleeves and sat on the edge of the cot, listening to the rain pound on the roof. When Rhett returned, he was even more drenched than before. He paused in the doorway at the sight of Leona in his coat, an expression crossing his face that made her breath catch. Horses are secure, he reported, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg. Storm's settling in, might be here a while. Leona nodded, suddenly shy. Thank you for the coat. Rhett moved to the stove, warming his hands. Suits you, he said, not looking at her. The small cabin grew quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the drumming of rain. Rhett found coffee and a few supplies in a cupboard and soon had a pot brewing on the stove. They sat at the table with steaming cups, the hot liquid warming them from inside. Tell me about your cabin in the high country, Leona said, breaking the silence. Is it like this one? Rhett shook his head. Bit bigger. Built it myself 4 years ago. Got a proper bed, table I made from pine, even shelves for books. You read. Leona couldn't hide her surprise. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. Don't let the rough exterior fool you, Miss Langford. I've read Shakespeare and Dickens, even some Emerson. I'm sorry, she said, embarrassed. I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken. His eyes held hers across the table. Most folks make assumptions based on how a man dresses or talks. You're not the first. I should know better, Leona admitted. People in Boston thought I was just a decorative object, a pretty face with no thoughts of my own. It was infuriating. Their loss, Rhett said simply. Something in his tone made her look up sharply, but his expression gave nothing away as he sipped his coffee. The storm showed no signs of abating as evening approached. Rhett found beans and salt pork in the supplies and prepared a simple meal while Leona set the table with the mismatched plates and utensils stored in a drawer. As they ate, Leona found herself studying Rhett's hands, strong and capable, yet gentle when they needed to be. She thought of how those same hands had steadied her when she stumbled on a rocky trail or demonstrated how to properly throw a lasso. "Something wrong with the food?" Rhett asked, noticing her distraction. Leona blushed, caught staring. "No, it's delicious, I was just thinking." "Dangerous pastime," he teased, a rare playfulness lighting his eyes. "I was thinking," she continued determinedly, "about how much I've learned since coming west, how much you've taught me." Rhett shrugged, uncomfortable with praise as always. "You're a quick study." "That's not what I meant." Leona set down her fork. "Before I met you, I thought I knew what kind of man I wanted: cultured, educated, predictable. But now I understand there are different kinds of strength, different ways of being honorable." Rhett went very still, his eyes never leaving her face. "Leona," he said, her name a warning or a plea, she couldn't tell which. "I know you're planning to leave soon," she pressed on, "but I want you to know that a crash of thunder directly overhead drowned out her words, making them both jump. Scout, who had been dozing by the stove, leaped up with a startled bark. At the same moment, a gust of wind blew the door open, extinguishing the lantern and sending rain spattering across the floor. Rhett moved quickly to secure the door while Leona relit the lantern with trembling hands. The moment, whatever it might have been, was lost. They finished their meal in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken words. As Leona helped clean up, their fingers brushed while passing a plate, sending a jolt of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. "You should take the cot," Rhett said as they finished. "Scout and I will be fine on the floor." Leona nodded, too emotionally exhausted to argue. She settled onto the narrow bed, still wearing Rhett's duster for warmth, while he made a pallet of blankets near the stove. Scout circled 3 times before curling up against his master's side. "Good night, Rhett," she said softly. "Good night," came his reply from the darkness. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded Leona. She lay listening to the storm and Rhett's steady breathing, wondering if he was awake too. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind: the almost conversation on the ridge, the frantic ride through the rain, the moment at dinner when she'd nearly confessed feelings she was only beginning to understand herself. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to find the cabin silent. The storm had passed and pale moonlight filtered through the single window. Rhett's blankets were empty, Scout gone as well. Heart suddenly racing, Leona rose and moved to the door. Had he left? Taken his chance to disappear rather than face whatever was growing between them. But when she stepped outside, she found him sitting on the rough-hewn bench beside the cabin, Scout lying at his feet. He was looking up at the stars, now visible in the clearing sky. Couldn't sleep. She asked, pulling his duster more tightly around her against the cool night air. Rhett glanced up, then moved over to make room for her. Too many thoughts. Leona sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. What kind of thoughts? He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and uncertain. "Been thinking about what you said earlier, about choosing a different path." He looked down at his hands. "I've been on the move so long, I don't know how to stay in one place anymore. Not sure I remember how to want something that ain't just over the next horizon." "What if," Leona said carefully, "what you want isn't a place at all, but a person?" Rhett turned to her then, his face half shadowed in the moonlight. "That would be the most terrifying thing of all." "Why?" She whispered, "Because losing a place just means finding another, losing a person." He trailed off, his gaze drifting to Scout, who watched them with alert eyes. Understanding dawned. "That's why you said it didn't matter when Scout was lost." "Because admitting how much he mattered meant admitting how much it would hurt to lose him." Rhett nodded slowly. "Been alone most of my life, safer that way." Safer, perhaps, Leona acknowledged, but lonelier too. She hesitated, then reached for his hand. Sometimes the risk is worth it. His fingers curled around hers, warm and calloused. And if I'm not the man you think I am, if I disappoint you, then we'll face that together. Leona smiled softly. I didn't come west looking for safety, Rhett Ingram. I came looking for a life worth living. Rhett's free hand came up to touch her cheek, his touch feather-light. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Leona Langford. Brave enough for this, she whispered and leaned forward to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them afraid of this new territory. But then Rhett's arms were around her, pulling her closer, and Leona felt as if she'd finally found home after a long journey. When they broke apart, both breathless, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. I should probably tell you, he murmured, that I've been making excuses to stay at your uncle's ranch for weeks now. Those traps I keep mentioning haven't seen a check in months. Leona laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. And I should probably tell you that Uncle Robert figured that out days ago. He's been matchmaking shamelessly. Scout chose that moment to nudge his way between them, tail wagging as if in approval. They both laughed, the tension of the evening dissolving into something warm and hopeful. Sun will be up soon, Rhett observed, looking toward the lightening eastern sky. We should head back before your uncle sends out a search party. Leona nodded, but neither made a move to leave. Instead, they sat together watching the stars fade as dawn approached, their clasped hands a promise neither needed to put into words just yet. By the time they returned to the ranch later that morning, Robert was indeed worried, though his concern quickly turned to knowing satisfaction when he saw them ride in together. Leona wearing Rhett's duster and both of them unable to stop smiling. Storm caught us up at the north pasture, Rhett explained. Took shelter in the line shack. I'm sure you did, Robert replied dryly. Coffee's hot if you want some. Over the next few weeks, Rhett found more and more reasons to delay his departure. There were fences to mend, cattle to brand, a new corral to build. Each evening found him and Leona on the porch, talking for hours as they watched the sunset, their growing feelings no longer a secret from each other or from Robert. On a warm July evening, Rhett took Leona riding to a meadow filled with wildflowers. Scout ran ahead of them, occasionally flushing rabbits or birds from the tall grass. They dismounted near a stand of aspen trees, spreading a blanket for a simple picnic of bread, cheese, and wild berries they'd gathered along the way. As they ate, Leona noticed Rhett seemed unusually distracted, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. Is everything all right? She asked. He nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a pair of horses standing close together, beautifully detailed. Made this for you, he said, placing it in her palm. Been working on it at night. Leona traced the delicate figures with her fingertips. It's exquisite, Rhett, thank you, he cleared his throat. There's something else, something I need to ask you. Her heart began to race as he took her hand in his. I'm not a wealthy man, he began. Got my cabin, some traps, a good horse, not much to offer a woman like you. Rhett, she started to protest, but he shook his head. Let me finish. All my life I've been running from my past, from getting too close to folks, from putting down roots. Then Scout ran off after that deer and I met you and everything changed. He looked into her eyes, his own full of emotion. I love you, Leona Langford. Will you marry me? Joy swept through her like a summer storm. Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. As he pulled her into his arms, Scout barked excitedly, racing circles around them as if celebrating in his own way. They laughed, their happiness too big to contain, as Rhett slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, his mother's ring. He explained, the one thing he'd kept from his past. They were married in Salida on a perfect September day in 1878, with Robert giving the bride away and Scout serving as an unofficial ring bearer. The entire town turned out for the celebration, Mrs. Hollister declaring it the social event of the year. After the ceremony, Rhett surprised Leona with the deed to a small parcel of land adjoining her uncle's ranch land with a view of the mountains and a stream running through a grove of cottonwoods. Thought we might build our home there, he said. Close enough to help your uncle, but a place that's just ours. Tears of happiness welled in Leona's eyes. It sounds perfect. By the following spring, their cabin was complete, larger than Rhett's bachelor dwelling in the high country, with proper glass windows and a stone fireplace. Leona planted a garden while Rhett built furniture, each piece lovingly crafted for their new home. Robert, now fully recovered from his broken leg, was a frequent visitor, especially after Leona discovered she was expecting their first child. The baby, a boy they named Thomas Robert Ingram after Rhett's brother and Leona's uncle, arrived on a snowy February night in 1880, with scouts standing guard outside the bedroom door throughout Leona's labor. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons: cattle drives in summer, hunting in fall, cozy evenings by the fire in winter, and the renewal of spring bringing fresh possibilities each year. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1882, followed by another son, James, in 1885. Scout grew old alongside them, his muzzle turning gray, his pace slowing but his devotion never wavering. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 14, the entire family mourned. They buried him beneath the largest cottonwood where wildflowers bloomed in summer. He had a good life, Leona consoled her husband as they stood together at the simple marker. And he brought us together. Rhett nodded, no longer ashamed of the tears that came. Best dog a man could ask for. Does it matter? She asked softly, echoing their first meaningful conversation. He looked at her, then at their 3 children playing nearby, at the home they'd built together, at the life they'd created from an unexpected meeting on a dusty Colorado road. It matters, he said, taking her hand. Everything matters. As they walked back to their home, Rhett's arm around Leona's shoulders, he reflected on how a lost dog and a woman brave enough to call him on his lies had changed the course of his life. The horizon no longer beckoned with its promise of escape. Instead, each sunset was merely the prelude to another dawn with the family he loved, the most valuable treasure a former drifter could ever find. And sometimes, in the quietest moments of dawn or dusk, Rhett would swear he could still hear Scout's bark calling him home.